Well, good evening.
Good evening.
It's great to see everybody here. Evan, you too. This is our, at least in my tenure, the third annual Lenten Lecture Series, and I want to welcome you to that. This year's lecture theme is on an emerging Christianity of the 21st century. Ways, and I will preface this by saying that this lecture series has grown out of a fairly robust discussion that's been happening at Adult Forum, and also for me, which has been a lifetime, or at least the last 20 years, of voraciously reading everything by Marcus Borg and Dominic Crossan, and even Bishop Jack Spong, as they have been sort of at the forefront of thinking about a new way to think about Christianity. And so we're going to be, over the course of this lecture series, presenting some new ideas about an emerging paradigm, and I'll say more about that, of Christianity. So to do that, we're going to take into account some recent biblical scholarship and view Scripture as it is, as a human creation with a historical context and a cultural context. We'll acknowledge and even embrace science and the base of knowledge that we people have formed over millennia, and what we know about ourselves and the world and the universe. And of course, we're going to incorporate a lot of and take a wonderful look at the traditions that we have within the Christian church. But all of this means that we're kind of looking at what it's kind of difficult to describe. The way Marcus Borg describes it is that it's an emerging paradigm of Christianity. So what does that mean? First off, let's just say, let's ask ourselves, what's a paradigm? And in the context of the Christian faith, we can think of it as the overarching worldview, the overarching understanding of how the Christian faith works, specifically how it thinks of God, how it thinks of Jesus, how it understands the Bible, how it understands what the problem with humanity is, how it understands with how we live out our day-to-day lives, and what the point is of all of this. So all of that together constitutes a paradigm. And we're going to be looking at an emerging version of this, and which then immediately begs the question, emerging from what? And so let me start by sort of naming and kind of outlining briefly what for many of us is the traditional understanding of what Christianity is all about. So the traditional paradigm of Christianity. This is something probably all of us grew up with, and it has been part of the air we've breathed for the entirety of our lives. I will also say that everything that I'm describing as the traditional paradigm is also fairly American or North American in its nature. This would be a little different if we were giving this lecture in Europe or Eastern Europe or North Africa. So this is also sort of a very, not uniquely, but specifically American traditional approach to Christianity. So, so in the traditional approach that we all grew up with Christianity, when we think about God, the first thing that we tend to think of God as a supernatural entity. And in this case, the official word that we use in theology is God is theistic, related to deistic, related to deity. So it is an entity that is out there. We traditionally think of this as male, not exclusively, but we often talk and think of this entity as male, as the creator. But there's a person-like being. There's a person-like aspect to God. We think of God as having, in the traditional forms of our thought, we think of God as having agency, as someone who has emotions, as something that has emotions, both love and anger. And because of that, specifically because of the anger, we think of God as something that can extract wrath and hurt and also be appeased. So part and parcel of our traditional thinking about God is that God is sort of, on one hand, supernatural, but also somewhat separate from reality, but can also manipulate reality, and intervenes in our lives, intervenes in creation, intervenes in reality, and so thus has the opportunities to protect and shield some, or send plagues and kill firstborn children of others. God can heal or not. God can save or not. But there is this idea that in the traditional theistic understanding of God, that God acts like a subject and we are God's objects. God is able to play chess with us and with all of reality. So that's kind of a real brief overview of how, in the traditional way Christianity is structured, we think of God as a theistic supernatural entity. How we think about the Bible, the traditional paradigm in which Christianity exists, the Bible is the unique revelation of the Word of God. Generally, it's taken literally. And while some stories, perhaps, Jonah and the whale, might be considered a parable or a fable, generally it's understood that, and goes unquestioned. Even some difficult things to believe, that Jesus was born of a virgin, or walked on water, or fed 5,000 with a couple loaves and fishes. These stories that we read about Jesus in the Bible are to be accepted as true and factual, and could have been videotaped if we were there. That's the traditional understanding of how the Bible is understood. It's seen as a divine product. It was given to humanity by God, and therefore is the divine authority, and therefore has to be followed. So that's the traditional notion of the Bible. The problem with humanity, the traditional approach to humanity is that the problem is that we are all rooted in sin. We don't follow the precepts that were given to us in the Bible and through tradition, and that sin has angered God or displeased God. We are out of a good relationship with God. And so therefore, at the core of Christianity is this belief that we are fundamentally sinful creatures out of sorts with God. And therefore, that is the primary problem that Christianity sets to address, is how to address our sinful nature. Which gets us then to Jesus. So in the classic, not classic, but in the traditional paradigm, Jesus is the solution to this problem of sin. Jesus is a sacrifice that appeases God and therefore restores our relationship with God. And that's the primary way to think of Jesus and understand it. It's that he was the Son of God whose sacrifice on the cross was necessary for us to have a right relationship with God in this traditional paradigm. And therefore, then that kind of gets us to the last part, which is what is the whole point? How is one, in the traditional paradigm of Christianity, how is one a good Christian? Well, one is a good Christian through faith. That is what gets you to heaven. And traditional Christianity has this focus on the next world, on getting to heaven. It seems to be the primary goal of all of this. That if you want to get to heaven, if one wants to get to heaven, that requires being faithful, which means specifically believing, assenting as if it were a fact, the central claims that we make about Jesus. That he's Son of God, born of a virgin, died on a cross to atone for our sins, and was raised physically, bodily from the dead. If you believe that, if you accept that, then your sins are also forgiven, and you have the distinct possibility of going to heaven. And kind of in that mix as well is the understanding within traditional Christian thinking that our daily lives are a lot about requirements and rewards, and that God through the Bible has many requirements for us. The reward of us paying attention to those requirements is our eternal reward in heaven. And also, I think implicit in that, or explicit in all of this too, is that Christianity, in the traditional understanding, is exclusive. It is the only solution to the problem of sin. It is the only access to heaven. Okay, now I've drawn that out, and I will suggest to you that, like, I've done that kind of in stark terms. I sort of cheated there a little bit. You know, I put it in real hard black and white terms. But I think all of us probably grew up with some version of that. And I would be very surprised if some of us don't hold on to parts of that. I know I do. I have parts of that equation or that paradigm that I'm still somewhat drawn to. Others I really, really, really struggle with. So what I want to also point out is that when we talking about emerging Christianity, so when I talk about a whole different way of viewing everything I've just described, I'm not doing that to the detriment or to the exclusion of the traditional understanding. They can both exist. And in fact, the traditional understanding has been an amazing boon for millions of people across time, and it still offers a lot of hope and peace for a lot of people. So I'm not refuting this. The discussions that we're having around an emerging Christianity are not an either or. I view them very much as a both and. That this is sort of an outgrowth and a different way of thinking about the Christian faith. All right, so I've kind of laid the groundwork. This lecture series, we weren't going to do this in 5 parts, but I've had to kind of punch it into 4 because I got sick last week. So in the course of this lecture series, we're gonna look tonight. We're gonna look at God and how we think about God, and as a result, how we think about what the fundamental problem with humanity is. So it was going to be 2 lectures. We're going to cram it into 1. That's going to cue Joseph up next week to talk about Jesus and who he is in this emerging understanding of Christianity. And then we will conclude the 3rd lecture will be about the Bible and how we understand the Bible as the heart of our tradition, even if that's perhaps not literally. And then lastly, the last lecture is going to be about how we live out our daily lives as Christians with this new understanding of God and Christ and the Bible. All right. So here we go. Earlier I mentioned that in the traditional understandings of God, that they're primarily rooted in what we call a theistic understanding. But let's back up for 1 second. I think a lot of people might struggle with the idea of like God being an old man in the sky. No one really wants to own up to that as they get a little bit older. But I think most of us, and I think most people, if you ask them, is there something more to life than just our physical reality? I think many of us would say yes. Or that we have a strong instinct that there is something more. This non-material layer of reality, and sort of an extra dimension of reality that we are perhaps only dimly aware of. And I think humanity has been struggling with how to name that and interact with that more for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And of course, what we inherited was a theistic way of relating to that more. And you can think about, I mean, it's just you can just look back at our history. When you read the Old Testament, the oldest books of the Old Testament, it's pretty clear that Yahweh, and Jews are not even allowed to say that name out loud, that Yahweh wasn't some universal God. It was the God of a branch of Semitic nomads who had formed themselves into a loose confederation of 12 tribes and then walked out of Egypt one day. And that was their God. There were lots of other gods out there, and there was no arguing that there were other. Everybody knew there were other gods. The Egyptians had plenty of gods. The Babylonians had gods. The Assyrians had gods. So it was nothing to have a God. It was just that Yahweh was the Israelite God. And then that notion, and that was a very theistic God. That was a God who made covenantal deals, made contracts, literal contracts with these people. He would do things like, provide manna, but then he would withhold it when he would get mad. He would kill the firstborn of the Egyptians to make the Israelites go away. So this was a God who angered, who needed to be appeased often. And we inherit a lot of that thinking. It just comes naturally to us. And of course, you think about the Greek and the Roman gods, and the Egyptian gods, the Celtic deities, and the Celtic gods that Christianity mingled with when it got up into the British Isles and over into Ireland. So I think we come by our all this is to say, I am a bit of an apologist in this regard. I think we come by our theistic notions naturally, honestly. We've inherited them. And we're trying now to realize they don't quite work with our experience. So we're trying now, in an emerging view of Christianity, in an emerging view of God, to talk and think about God a little differently. Not as a theistic entity that's playing chess and intervening in our lives, but as God as an encompassing spirit in whom everything that is. The universe is not separate from God, but in God. And God is in every aspect of the universe. There are plenty of biblical references to this. Probably one of the more well-known in the book of Acts, where it talks about God, the God in whom we live and move and have our being. Talking about Christianity has long, particularly in the debates that rose up after Jesus around the nature of God as Trinity. One of the things that was continually argued over was that God was transcendent throughout all of the universe and also immanent, as in present everywhere. And so that's kind of the official theological word for this kind of thinking is panentheism, that God is in and through everything. God is a spirit that courses through all creation. And the metaphor that I love to use, many of you have heard me use this before, and I offer this, and of course it's a metaphor, so it breaks down, it's imperfect. But thinking about God as almost an ocean in which we are all swimming. An ocean in which we are all living and moving and have our being. It just courses through everything. And so, in that sense, you could say that, well, it's not this, so this type of understanding of God isn't theistic. It doesn't have emotions and anger. It doesn't have feelings like that. But it is, in its essence, connective. It connects everything. And the way we think about that, the way we can talk about that is, it is all this, God is all about the connection, the relationship, the love that connects all of creation. And that love is related, it relates to compassion, connection, and love. That's the nature of the divine. And we swim in it. We live in it. It is in whom we live and move and have our being. Interestingly enough, if you think about the character or the nature of thinking of God in this way as something that we are just in the midst of, part of, that is rooted in relationship, connection, compassion, and love, how does that play out in community? What is the nature of God as it plays out in church or in Lewisburg or in the world? And the nature in which it plays out is that it has to play out in those relationships, in those connections, in that compassion and love, in justice, in fairness. That's how it plays out. That's how it's activated in our lives. So it's interesting thinking about God in this way. It has a couple ramifications. It has a couple, there's a domino effect that happens when you change your perspective and start thinking about God in these universal, loving, compassion, connected ways. One is the notion of God intervening sort of starts to fall by the wayside. And we start to realize that God is not playing chess with history. That's not the nature of the ocean, to play chess, to decide. The ocean doesn't decide who gets to be the biggest fish and who gets to be the little fish. The fish are just the fish, doing their fishy things in there. And so, as opposed to thinking of what God does, it's kind of beneath all of that, and we start to realize that God just is. And so therefore, that changes our prayer life. That has an immediate impact on prayer. If you think about how often we come to God and pray for God to manipulate reality. That is our most common prayer. Fix this, heal that, do away with this, bring that up. That's that theistic notion of God coming on strong. And we're reluctant to give that up, and I understand that. I still pray those types of prayers too. But it also encourages us to think about that perhaps the proper attitude to prayer is just opening ourselves up to the love, the life, the compassion, and the connection that is God. That becomes now the primary source and benefit and whole purpose of prayer, of life, really, of opening ourselves up to God's presence all around us. And that viewing prayer really is that. It is opening ourselves up to God. And I think that as God, as life, as love, as connection, as relationship, there is healing there, by the way. There is love there, by the way. And opening ourselves up and praying for others to be open to that, I think, we can give ourselves over to that spirit that pervades all of us and be healed and transformed by that. And so I think prayer takes on more of that kind of a perspective as opposed to God, please play chess with me or my family in the way that I want you to play chess. So again, the way we think about God impacts. It has an impact on our daily lives. The other major way in which I think how we think about God matters is again, and this is sort of me cramming two lectures into one, is thinking about what the fundamental problem with humanity is. It's a little funny to say to a fish that's swimming in the ocean, you know what your fundamental problem is? Sin. The fish is like, well, I'm just eating the things that I'm supposed to be eating, and people are eating me the way they're supposed to be eating me. How is sin the fundamental problem? And how does the fish get out of sorts with the ocean? How does a fish anger the ocean? So much so that the ocean decides, well, you and I are no longer in relationship with each other. It doesn't make sense, right? Like that just can't happen. So I hope we can make this jump. I mean, I'm struggling to make it myself, but if we think about God as this universal spirit that pervades all of us, it starts to reason that maybe sin isn't the fundamental problem. That we don't have a God who is angry with us, who needs to be appeased with a sacrifice for us to be okay with God. That whole paradigm kind of starts to fall apart, and a new one sort of remains in its place. That what is the fundamental problem with God, with us, is perhaps that we are just unaware of our relationship with God. We are unaware of the love and connection and compassion and relationship that we have with all of creation. And when we are unaware of that, we do pretty horrible things to creation, to ourselves, and to our neighbors, and to our world. So, in some sense, what happens is instead of the fundamental problem of humanity being one of sin, it's almost one of estrangement. We are estranged from God, unaware of God's presence in our life, and therefore not filled with that love and compassion and connection that comes from the divine. So, with that shift in that paradigm, sin begins to lose its steam as a fundamental problem. You can't imagine the essence of love and compassion that connects all of us. You can't imagine that as anger or or filled with wrath. So appeasement no longer seems to be necessary, right? We don't need to appease God. God just is. And so the whole notion of there needing to be a blood sacrifice to appease God, to make God okay with us, to restore our relationship with us, sort of stops making as much sense as it perhaps once did. And so what we're going to find next week is that this fundamentally changes how we think about Jesus and what his role was, what his experience of God was, and what he wanted to teach us about God, and about restoring our relationship with God. So that I've kind of queued Joseph up for next week. And so where he gets to take this sort of new and emerging understanding of the divine, and if Jesus isn't necessary as a blood sacrifice so that we're okay with God, then who is Jesus? Stay tuned next week for the exciting conclusion to that question. So I've gone on about as long as I wanted to tonight, and I know there are those of you who want to skive off quickly and get to the concert at Carnegie Hall. You are excused to do so. However, I would also love to entertain any and all questions about this.
This follows along with the chapter, which I actually read already.
Yeah.
Adult class.
Yeah. So Ruth is referring to the book that we're all reading in our adult forum called "The Heart of Christianity" by renowned biblical scholar and New Testament scholar Marcus Borg. And so I have drawn a lot of inspiration from him in this lecture. So, yep, we are reading that. I'm curious to you. I mean, does anybody relate to the older traditional forms of Christianity and the emerging forms and the sort of, I'm just kind of curious what your reaction to that is.
Fire and brimstone. Yeah.
Yeah.
But how does this compare to like Buddhism? This sounds more like Buddhism than, God's.
Yeah.
For another lecture. Right?
I mean, I do think that you start to see some. Well, I think what happens, even that at some level, you do start to see some similarities with other elements of world religions when you do this. And I think there's some Buddhist teachings that I do think align with this. There's some Taoist teachings that align with this. Certainly a lot of the more mystical elements within all of the world religions, I think, would start to align a bit with this. Yeah, Kathy?
I relate to the concept of estrangement
Uh-huh.
as opposed to, God playing chess with us all.
Yeah.
And when you talk about the fish in the ocean, literally, I don't think fish are estranged from God,
Right.
but we
Uh-huh.
we have a will to do that
Mm-hmm.
or not, to come to God or not.
Mm-hmm.
Or to move away from it, whereas the rest of creation is just, like you say, immersed.
There
I
you go.
can relate to that.
Yeah.
It seems to be our so-called free will that
Yeah.
gives us problems.
Yeah.
Is that gonna, there are Christian faiths that believe that there's already a plan for you.
Yeah.
There's a road already laid out.
Yeah.
So how does that go along with the new paradigm? I mean, I don't believe there's a road laid out.
Yeah. No, I think an emerging paradigm would probably not say that there's a plan. I mean, I think, what this paradigm does sort of allow you to kind of bring in all of science and everything we know about evolution and the human mind and all of that. We have some inner parts of us that are cave people, and that are, need to survive, and are, when threatened, to do violent things and all of that. And, we're evolving, I think, constantly. And I think we're evolving in our understanding of our connection to each other and all of that. So I don't think there's any, I don't think in this emerging understanding, there's any idea that, again, God is playing chess with it. There's a plan. I just think there is an encouragement almost to open oneself, but there's no guarantee you're going to do anything, right?
Yeah, I've always felt like you're living your life and there's something that happens.
Yeah.
And you can choose this way or you can choose that.
Yeah.
And sometimes you make a right or wrong choice, which affects the rest of your life. But I've never felt like God had already decided what I was going to decide then.
Right.
Because if he's already decided what I'm going to decide then at least he could make me make the right decision.
Yeah. Right. Our friend Ann Walker is a Presbyterian, and that's that Calvinist thinking you're talking about. I'm just teasing the Presbyterians. Yeah. Yeah.
The whole metaphor of the ocean, I think, makes me think of a transcendentalist, like I think Emerson.
Yeah.
I think it was Emerson, those guys, with mid-century 1800s, I guess it was. And they believe that, it was Emerson, is that we're kind of like puddles that were left at low tide
Okay.
on the beach.
Wow.
And then high tide were rejoined.
Uh-huh.
That whole thing with the.
Oh, yeah. Now yeah, I think that works with that metaphor really well. Because one of the, you're always sort of searching for a metaphor for how to understand our condition. And so, if sin and repentance isn't the overarching metaphor, but one of the ones that Borg and others will talk about is either the estrangement that we meant, or kind of like that we've been that we're exiled. We're in like a self-imposed exile. We've gotten separated from the ocean in our own little tidal pool, and we want to get rejoined with the ocean. So that kind of fits in there really well. I like that a lot. That's great.
So sin, as we think of it in the traditional sense, is, basically sin is not defined as what we think of it in traditional, but as the separation, just separation. Like, growing up, you always thought the word sin meant you did something bad.
Yeah.
But sin really is, the word really is separation.
Well, I think.
What is it? Really?
Yeah, that's good. That's a good question, because I do think, generally speaking, in the traditional understanding of Christianity, sin is doing something bad. Literally like missing the mark. Swinging and a miss, kind of thing. And that also fits with. That's biblical too. That's definitely rooted in Scripture. That understanding of sin. So I do think you do start to get a little more nuanced, and I think helpful view of that when you realize, okay, what's the impact of this sin, or maybe it's even a circumstance that caused the sin. But in any case, there is a separation between us and God somehow, a self-imposed exile. We've been separated from the ocean or whatever. And I think that's a really helpful way of talking about sin and salvation. It's a separation and then a reconnection. Did that answer the question at all?
Yeah, I was, yes, it did.
Okay. I don't know if it did or not. I'm not convinced myself that I answered it.
No, for me, I thought of it in, like, when you were talking about it, I was like, yes, that makes sense to me in my brain. That there is sin which causes, it's a cause and effect,
Yeah.
essentially.
Yeah. Other thoughts and questions?
I got one.
Sure.
So original sin was supposed to be Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve created the original sin.
Yeah.
Oh, happily, yeah.
Yeah.
And we're all doomed after that. We're all,
Yep.
sinful, right?
Yep. Yep.
So
We're born
all-
into sin.
We're all born into
Yeah.
original sin.
Yep.
Okay? So we are naturally estranged until we're redeemed by Jesus.
Yes.
Okay? So maybe that was that the Garden of Eden, in the Garden of Eden, the Adam and Eve, even though that's a myth, fell away from the consciousness which is God, pervades everything. Fell away, whether it's estrangement, we call it sin, could we call it estrangement, separation, and that they did not know how to tap back into the consciousness. Because they had to leave the Garden of Eden, they got kicked out. So they got kicked out of the meditation place or whatever it was,
Yeah.
where they could tap into consciousness,
Okay.
which is God.
Okay.
And that, where I was in the Catholic religion, when I was raised, everybody that died before Jesus died was kind of in the waiting room,
Yeah.
in limbo,
Right.
waiting. Okay, so if all those people, maybe that Jesus came along to kind of teach people how to tap back in, and that's how he redeemed them from original sin. If they tap back in, they tap back into the consciousness which is God, and Jesus taught us how to do that. He's not redeemed as a blood sacrifice as much as he is an example to show us how to tap back in. And anybody who believed that Jesus could be killed, tortured and killed, and still came back out and still taught us how to tap back into God, he was the path. So in other words, he was just kind of a light to tap us back into the consciousness. And that's how he redeemed original sin, which is really a separation from the consciousness which is God.
Well. About that, I didn't do that.
Well, and I would say that is a wonderful, so one of the things that you've done there is you've taken as you mentioned, the myth of Adam and Eve, and kind of used that metaphorically to explain the human condition and how we can, and an understanding of Jesus that is outside in some ways that's really kind of outside the dominant paradigm of the Christian understanding. So I mean, I think what you've just done is an example of this kind of emerging understanding of Christianity. So I applaud that. Cool. Tom, will you? Oh, go ahead.
I was always taught and of the impression, and I still do, this is still something that I think about, but that God gave ways for those pre-Christ to show them that you can't do it on your own. The Ten Commandments being the most prominent of those things. No one can ever possibly do those things on their own, that you need God. God, if you have God as a part of your life, that those things are possible, and I think that was, in what I understand or have understood in my life is that was the gift of Jesus, to be able to show, what you said, like having a relationship with God, how to have a relationship with God, and then, because humans can't do it. Does that make sense?
It does. I don't want to get too much into Jesus because I don't want to steal Jesus'
I'm
thunder.
not gonna-
I mean, not Jesus, Joseph's thunder next week. He's the one that's got to. I want him to take that on full on. Oh, and by the way, everybody knows next week it's on Wednesday, not Thursday. Okay. Yeah. Next week it's Wednesday, not Thursday. The reason is that I'm out of town, and Joseph and Amy both have a clergy obligation for the diocese on Thursday next Thursday evening. They will not be in town either, so we have to move it. Just next week. The lecture is at 6 o'clock on Wednesday. That'll be in all the announcements. I'm sure it'll be in all the emails.
Can I make one quick announcement too? I believe if you have a link to go to the sign-up sheet, I believe I looked yesterday, and we may need another student next week. And I know for sure the following week there are 3 spots open, and I think the following week maybe 2. So there's still some spots open. We're usually pretty good on bread and drinks, but.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Maybe it was.